I will speak on the question of the relationship between what it is that we think as European institutions we are doing when we promote democracy. We could talk about development, stability, security, but today I've chosen democracy. And what it is that populations in the 7 countries that we surveyed think of those efforts. Now, I'm going to argue that there's a mismatch between what it is that the European Union supplies and what it is that populations locally want, and certainly what they see of the European Union. And in part, that's bad news because it means that there are certain things, certain limits to the policies that we're pursuing. On the other hand, there's also good news because it means that there's a window of opportunity that we can hopefully use to design policy more appropriately. So first of all, actually before I start, I'd just like to say a little bit more about the project itself. So Monica, who is the director of our IAX, one of our partners, and they carried out fantastic surveys in Iraq and in Libya, so particularly difficult circumstances. The logic of the project is roughly the following. We conducted surveys in the latter half of 2014, public opinion surveys across 7 Middle Eastern countries. Those surveys are designed in such a way as they would plug into existing sister surveys of Arabarometer. We have Mark Robbins, who's the director of the Arabarometer, here with us today, who's our board of advisors, World Value Survey, Afrobarometer, and so on. So we try to plug in partly existing questions, partly new questions into a wealth of data that already exists. The reason for this is to try and understand how these perceptions in Middle Eastern countries evolve over time and what that tells us about the processes of social, economic, and political transformation. We then place those data about perceptions in relation to macro indicators that are more, broadly speaking, objective to see whether there's a discrepancy between these two things, whether people think one thing but in fact reality is different, vice versa. And then plug both of those into area scholarship, so people who have expertise about local conditions, local knowledge, of which, of course, local partners are a crucial component. So that's the logic of the project. And you see this logic reflected in the kind of work that we're all going to be presenting today and this presentation as well. So, first of all, let's start with what it is that the European Union thinks it does when it promotes democracy. I mean, we know that democracy is, at least rhetorically, a central plank of the way in which the neighbourhood policy is designed, and of course, recently it takes a little bit more of a backseat to security, and but nonetheless, it's a crucial component. So, what we've done is to look at what it is the European Union thinks it's doing when it promotes democracy. And if we look at all the key documentation that the European Union has produced since the Arab uprising, so since the Partnership for Democracy and Shared Prosperity, which was published on the 8th of March 2011, so very, very soon after the Tunisian and Egyptian uprisings have concluded, what we see is that in the preambles of these documents, you have a very rich, very nuanced, very rounded, organic notion of what democracy is. It's not just free and fair elections, it's also a bunch of other stuff, social inclusion, inclusive growth, so that an idea of equitability and inclusion that's integral to that notion of democracy. Unfortunately, when you look at the bodies of these documents, and as you look at these documents over time, that second element tends to disappear. So the emphasis ends up, although later documentation talk about deep democracy, in practice if you ask what it is that deep democracy is, you find yourself with essentially the answer is free and fair elections, human rights, by which these documents mean civil and political rights rather than social and economic ones, and then other elements such as gender, minorities, and so on. So you have this kind of impoverishment of the notion of democracy. One of the reasons for this is because there's a hierarchy and a selectivity at the heart of these ideas of democracy. The hierarchy being we do the civil and political rights first, and then later we do the social and economic dimensions. It's not that the social and economic dimensions are not there, they are, but they are relegated to questions of trade policy, economic relations, models of growth. The problem is that those models of growth haven't been challenged. So the socio-economic dislocation that was produced by economic reforms in the decade and a half prior to the uprisings, that hasn't really been acknowledged. On paper, of course, but in practice, if you look at the details, the models, the instruments, the strategies, the tactics remain the same. So, in relation to social and economic rights, one of the ways of showing this impoverishment is to look at the way these documents talk about democracy. And what's striking is the fact that in these documents, while the word democracy is always associated with civil and political rights, it's never associated with social and economic rights. It's associated with social and economic issues, but those issues are never spoken about in terms of rights. So you have the language of rights on the one hand and the language of issues of aid and trade on the other. Now this is important because, for no other reason, it tells us about the priorities that are in policymakers' minds, but also there's an important shift. If I have a right, then I have there's a moral duty on you to respect that right. If you are giving me aid or negotiating trade, then essentially what you're doing is you're giving me concessions. Right? So the moral economy, the politics of those two different ways of phrasing things are quite different. So, in short, this is the conceptual structure of democracy that you have. It focuses on civil and political rights, it focuses on free and fair elections, and important as these things are, they marginalize or they set to one side, they delay economic and social rights, and that has an effect. That actually has a very important effect. The extent of that effect we'll see when we talk about what it is that people actually want in the Middle East. So we have several questions in the survey that pertain to issues of social justice, economic models, notions of democracy, and so on. One of the questions we asked was for respondents to identify the two most important characteristics of democracy in their view. And what we've done is we've clustered those answers. They could choose from a list of several options. And we've clustered those answers depending on whether the answers have to do with whether they pertain to a civil or political right on the one hand or social economic right on the other. And you'll see a self-standing category of corruption. The reason for that is that corruption is really a nexus between the political and economic, so it's not easily, you can't easily slot it into either of those two categories. And it also turns out to be a very important factor in motivating people to protest in the uprisings in the first place. So it's useful to have that as a self-standing category. Now, as you can see, in most cases, with the exceptions of Iraq and Libya, and Tunisia as well, but in most of the cases we're looking at, in half the cases, the political rights are not as important to respondents as social and economic rights. So what this is telling us is that priorities for the populations are not so much the civil and political, but the substantive aspects in a sense of democracy. It's great that I have these rights in theory to vote or to protest or to form free associations, but I would also like to see those principles translated into the delivery, into a substantive delivery. Now, the importance of this more rounded approach to democracy, or in any case, rounded approach to political preferences, you can see when we look at other data. So when we asked people what it was that they thought drove protesters to go into the streets in the Arab uprisings or Arab Spring, again, we can use the same kind of categorization. And here we see even more clearly the importance of the economic and social economic dimension. So again, we see a similar pattern here. The notion that we focus on, the concepts that we focus on in Western governments, Western institutions, in promoting democracy and thinking about political stability is, let's say, institutional, procedural. We want to make sure that the institutions are in place in order for people to have a voice and so on. And while that's a necessary condition for democracy and for political inclusion, it's not a sufficient condition. And I think what respondents are telling us is that while it's fine for them to have those rights in theories, they also want to see those political systems deliver in fact. Again, if you ask, there's other questions that we ask in the survey. One of the classic questions is to identify the two main challenges that people think their country is facing. And here the social economic question comes out even more clearly. So look at Egypt, for example. 90% of people nominate as either their first or their second most important challenge economic questions. You can see across the board that with the one exception of Libya, economic factors are at least as important as political factors. In Iraq, marginally, but in all the other cases, very clearly. Okay. So we think that this means people want substantive delivery as well as in principle. Then there's the question of how to deliver. In particular, what kind of political system is best suited to deliver these kinds of objectives that people are, these kinds of priorities that people have. The classic question here, the thorny question is, do people, is the Middle East ready for democracy, as it were? It's the kind of question that exercises a lot of my colleagues in political science. It turns out that the answer is quite, it's quite a resounding yes on one level, and we have to see exactly how. But you can see when people are asked straight questions, do you think democracy is incompatible with Islam? Right? One of the classic themes in the political science literature is Islam compatible with democracy. Of course, you see here that there's a very strong response across the board, across countries, that democracy is in fact compatible with Islam. You have some significant minorities that don't think so, but nonetheless, the consensus is very clear. You can ask follow-up questions. For example, is democracy better than alternatives? Is what I call the Churchill question. Churchill famously said democracy is the worst possible political system except for all the others. And this is, so you could say, Middle Eastern respondents have a very Churchillian kind of response to democracy. If you've asked also follow-up questions, should governments make laws according to the wishes of the people? Again, very strong belief in most countries. Jordan is a bit of an exception here, that they should. And this suggests to us also that people are after more effective implementation of political rights, which they might be perceiving that they're not getting at the moment. Now, I don't want to go into too much data into too much detail for reasons of time on questions of religious law, religious sources of law. But safe to say that again, in a lot of public debate as well as in the academic literature, there is a focus on Islam as being an obstacle towards political empowerment, towards democracy in particular, and therefore towards also social, economic, and political transformations in the region. What I'd like you to take away from this data is that actually the relationship that respondents see between religiosity, their own religiosity, as you can see from the previous slide, most people, the vast majority, self-identify as at least partly, at least somewhat religious. So the relationship between that religiosity and how that translates into preferences for various areas of law is highly varied, both across countries and within particular areas of law. Family law, criminal law, inheritance law. People have a nuanced understanding of what it is that they would like to see taken from principles of religious law and translated into state law. We also ask a specific question about the form of government that people would like to see implemented. And here, it's quite clear where you have, in some contexts, a strong preference for parliamentary democracy, in most cases, in fact. In Jordan and Libya and Morocco, the data is actually quite polarized. So if you look actually a little bit more in detail at the data, what you see is two identifiable groups. One that supports parliamentary democracy in a kind of very conventional, classic sort of sense, and another that supports the establishment of an Islamic authority. What exactly an Islamic authority means to these respondents is difficult to tell, but that's the nature of surveys, so we need to do some follow-up research on qualitative research. And I have 5 minutes or 5 seconds? 5 minutes. Normally I have 5 seconds. What comes out of this data is that there are, broadly speaking, two clusters within most of respondent countries. Two clusters. One that supports parliamentary democracy, another that supports a kind of authoritarian system of some description, right? And for me that's interesting because on the one hand, I mean, the way that I read that data is that on the one hand there's a group, there's a cluster which represents an opportunity for local policymakers as well as for international policymakers to advance a kind of a progressive agenda. On the other hand, there's another identifiable and very significant cluster of people who are very frustrated with the social, political, economic systems such as they are at the moment. So it's a call for intervention. On the one hand, we have the European Union, in our case, attempting to supply, so to speak, if I can abuse economic terminology, supply democracy. But it's a very specific kind of democracy. On the other hand, you see respondents in the Middle East demanding a political system that delivers on issues that are not currently being targeted by European policy in the way that respondents want them to be targeted. So, in a sense, the supply of democracy doesn't match the demand for a kind of democracy that we get from the Middle East. This is, of course, worrying because it means that it affects the perception of the European Union as a normative actor. It affects regional stability. So it contributes to creating those kinds of structural conditions that actually led up to the uprisings. One thing that I haven't mentioned, but comes out of our research also, is that there's no particularly significant difference between what the European Union has done since the uprisings and before the uprisings. So some of the language changes, for example, the phrase deep democracy, the phrase more for more. But if you look at what those things mean, negative and positive conditionality, for example, were present in EU policy before 2010. And also before 2010, there's this notion that elections are not enough. It's not spelled out in the same way. So my concern is, on the one hand, European institutions are supplying one kind of democracy. What there is demand for in the Middle East is a different kind of democracy. To the extent that these things don't match, we sustain conditions for instability and potentially mobilization in a kind of much more radical direction than we've seen with the Arab uprisings themselves. So on that cautionary note, I'll conclude. I'll hand over to Pam.
Thank you, Andrea.